My name is Stephen Pope. I'm a professor in the theology department. I'm here to welcome you to what will be, I'm sure, a very interesting, lively presentation and discussion. I want to ask you first if you would please turn off your cell phones, silence your cell phones, cut them off, drown them, whatever you have to do to keep them quiet. I'd like to thank the sponsors of this event, which include the Wazi Center, the Department of Continuing Education at the School of Theology and Ministry, the Theology Department, the Pulse Program, the Catholic Studies Program, the Volunteer and Service Learning Center, and the Church in the 21st Century. A lot of sponsors. I probably could have just mentioned the people that didn't sponsor this talk. I think that says a lot. The size of our crowd here and the number of sponsors show the appeal today, continued appeal of Dorothy Day and her family. Today there'll be lots of time for question and answer discussion. So we'll have two parts of this event. The first will be a presentation by Kate Hennessy of her book, The World Will Be Saved by Beauty, and then a conversation moderated by the acting head of the Wazi Center, Eric Owens. There are copies of this book in the lobby. It would be nice if you wanted to pick up a copy, and I'm sure Kate would be willing to sign a copy for you. So I'm just here to introduce our speaker, Kate Hennessy. She was in my class yesterday, a class called Faith, Service, and Solidarity, in which several students here came back to hear more because they found that talk so compelling and opening up a side of Dorothy Day that is unknown to most people, even people that have read a lot of her work. So I think the timing of the book and the interest it's aroused and the way that it supports a lot of people and their social commitment and their connection between faith and reality, faith and the social reality we live in, is a very, very welcome contribution to the literature on Dorothy Day, to our understanding of her work and her continued legacy. Kate Hennessy is a writer and the youngest of Dorothy Day's 9 grandchildren. She's the author of Dorothy Day, The World Will Be Saved by Beauty, the book I just mentioned, subtitled An Intimate Portrait of My Grandmother, published by Scribner. She has worked in collaboration with the photographer Vivian Cherry on a book called Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker, The Miracle of Our Continuance, and her work has appeared in Best American Travel Writing. Kate attended New York University and the School for International Training in Vermont. She's traveled and worked around the world, including at an international summer camp in the former USSR, ESL teacher in Guatemala, and to Tibetan refugees in India, as well as worked as a curator at a small Vermont museum. She has also walked 750 kilometers, not to go up the stairs to get to upper campus or middle campus here, but 750 kilometers on the Camino de Santiago in Spain. She now lives in Vermont. With that, would you please give a warm welcome to Kate Hennessy.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you all for inviting me and then for coming to listen. It really is an honor. This whole experience that I've been having written this book and going around the country and speaking to people about it, has been extraordinary. And I really am full of gratitude, not only for the opportunity to be able to write this story, which it really is a story that wrote itself in a way. It's a fabulous story. I love it in terms of who my grandmother was and who my mother was. And just their lives were so rich, so many things to offer us. And then I just feel so grateful that I was able to write it. Of course, that's not saying that it wasn't hard. It was very hard to write. It came out of a period of mourning. I lost my mother in 2008, and during this period, There is something that happens, and I know there's many people in the room who understand what I'm saying, but with the death of a parent, particularly the death of a mother, your whole world is turned upside down, and your heart is broken wide open. And in that space came the knowledge, the understanding that I had to write the story of my mother. Now, the subtitle is An Intimate Portrait of My Grandmother, and this really is not quite true. It's a portrait of my grandmother and my mother, and it is a story of my grandmother as seen through and experienced by my mother. I mean, this was the whole foundation of how I started writing and how I continued to write, because I felt that, I mean, there are many books out there about Dorothy Day. There are articles I haven't even begun to explore. There's so much written about her, and she's fun to write about. I mean, what a fabulous story. Theologians, historians, people who are neither, just, moved by her story, have taken on this task of writing about her. So why yet another story? Now, the obvious answer is that no one from her family has written one. And so we can come from, or I can come from a position of knowing her personally. But this isn't enough just to know her personally. To me, the thing that part of me, I never prepare for these talks, so I'm always kind of like thinking out loud, and it always changes. This is one of the wonderful things about these conversations, is that I keep learning about what I think. I don't know if there are some writers in the audience, I'm sure there are, that you don't know what you think until you write it down. Well, that's true with me, and also I don't know what I think until I'm forced to say things in front of large crowds of people. So bear with me while I make things up as I go along. But I think, many of you know of my grandmother, I'm sure. Many of you have, some of you I know have met her. So I think I can assume that I don't need to do a little bio of who she was. Can I make that assumption that we're all a little? Okay. Well, in a nutshell, my grandmother was the co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. She was a writer. She was people like to call her a social activist. And it's funny, I have a hard time kind of using that term because it's it's not detailed enough for me. She was a woman of great vision, great energy, great, tremendous power, and she believed that it was in her power to help make a world where it was easier to be good. She sacrificed a great deal, and a lot of what my book is about sacrifice, both on her part and my mother's part. She wrote tremendously. She was a prolific writer, and she started this movement in the 1930s. In 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, in New York City, she started this, she did not mean to be houses of hospitality. She did not mean to start soup lines. She saw herself as a writer. She saw herself as a journalist. And what she wanted to do was write to people, to say, this is what's happening in the world as a journalist. She wanted to write about the strikes, the hunger marches, the unrest, the terrible unrest that was happening in the US at that time. The sheer numbers of people who were unemployed during the Great Depression, it's unimaginable now. And so out of this time of great strife and difficulties, the Catholic Worker emerged, first as a paper. She met in 1932 after several years, 5 years of, and I'm really putting her life in a nutshell here. I mean, read the book and you'll find out a lot more. But she met a man, Peter Morin, who said to her, She was trying to, at that point, she'd been a Catholic for 5 years. She converted to Catholicism at the birth of my mother, after the birth of my mother, which was a profound experience for her. She didn't believe that she could get pregnant, that she could have children, because she had experienced a horrific abortion 6 years before, and she thought that she would never be able to conceive again. And she did with my mother, Tamar. And that birth just flooded her, speaking of gratitude, flooded her with gratitude. And that process, I mean, this is a very complicated process. The process of conversion is very complicated, and we would all love to know what happened with her. But she didn't know, you know. So I think we all are just going to have to try our best to understand what happened to her in terms of our own conversions. I think we all undergo conversion one way or the other, or certainly if we are thinking, feeling people. But in this process of giving birth to my mother, she first had my mother baptized as a Catholic. And a little less than a year later, she then entered the Catholic Church. And I always like to remind people of this fact that my mother was the first Catholic in the story. And it is part of my grandmother's very interesting ways is that she had her child baptized in a religion that neither parent belonged to. So fast forwarding 5 years after this conversion, after becoming Catholic, you know, she had been struggling. She saw herself as a writer. She was making a living as a writer. She had been involved for many years with the radical groups of New York City, very much on the forefront of reporting on what was happening, and very much involved. I mean, she had already been arrested once, her first arrest at the age of 20, protesting for the right for women to vote. She couldn't quite figure out how to bring these two things together, her Catholicism, her newfound religion, and her desire to help in the world. And it wasn't until she met Peter Morin, who was a French peasant, who had highly educated, highly well-read, and who knew about the Catholic Church's teachings on social justice and social action. My grandmother had no idea at that point. No one had discussed this with her. She didn't join the church because of its teachings on social justice. Pardon me. And so this was like dynamite to her, to realize that, wait, she can combine these two things. That her deep interest and love of what is happening to the most vulnerable of people and her newfound religion. And in this wondrous understanding, the Catholic Worker Movement was born. And as I said, it started as a newspaper. Peter had actually asked her to publish his writings. That was his idea of what she could do to help him. Well, she had different ideas. She knew how to publish a newspaper. Not only did she know how to write as a journalist, but she knew how to physically lay out a newspaper, what was needed to be done. And she just took this and made it her own. Now, of course, Peter didn't quite understand this and didn't quite agree with this. And after the first issue, he said, everybody's paper is no one's paper. And he kind of backed away editorially. But she wasn't going to stop. She was on the path. On May Day of 1933, she and a handful of other people went out to Union Square, where they always had a huge gathering, May Day protests. Usually a lot of the members of the Communist Party, Socialist Party, the anarchists, the Wobblies, the IWWs, you know, a lot of people gathered on May Day traditionally to kind of express their anger and concerns. Well, the Catholic Worker was being handed out next to the Daily Worker, and people were amazed. One, they had no idea that the Catholic Church had any program of social justice. And two, a lot of them didn't believe her, thought that she was pulling their leg. But from this small beginning, and it was a printing of 2,500, from this small beginning, things just blossomed. As I mentioned earlier, she didn't mean to start a house of hospitality. That actually was meant for the bishops to do. Peter Morin wanted the bishops to open up houses of hospitality. And what happened instead was that people started showing up at their doorstep. This was in Manhattan, East 15th Street, and saying, we need help. And so my grandmother, being the person never to kind of doubt herself, she never second-guessed herself. She really operated from this wonderful, instinctive sense of what to do next. And it would drive many people crazy because she would do things that didn't seem to make sense. Her entire life actually didn't seem to make sense. But it was genius, and in her genius, she said, okay, let's start renting apartments. The apartments then became too small. They rented an entire building. That became too small. They just kept growing. And the paper kept growing from that small beginning of 2,500. And 3 years later, it was 160,000, and one issue was 190,000. Catholic worker places started opening up around the country. So it's hard to imagine the fire that she lit under people, that really inspired their imagination with this movement that she started. Now, this is not an organization. There are some people in this room who know exactly what I mean when I say that the Catholic worker movement is not an organization. Peter used to call it an organism. And there are, to this day, it's hard to count the houses because houses come and go, but there are about 250 houses of hospitality and farms that attach themselves to the name of Catholic worker, that feel that they have been inspired and are basing their houses or their farms on the teachings of my grandmother and Peter Morin. So it is still very much alive, what they have done. There's no membership, you don't join it, you don't have to claim anything. I mean, there are some people who say, well, you have to do this, you have to be this if you're a Catholic worker. But, there's no enforcement. It is totally up to you to start it. And to me, that also is an element of my grandmother's genius. And I think that's the reason why the Catholic worker still exists today and is still going strong, because it is such a personal decision on people's part. It is personal responsibility, which she believed so absolutely in. And not only she did, but my mother did too. I mean, the way that people come into the Catholic worker is so organic in a way that I think it's really refreshing to see this kind of activity in what I see as a highly institutionalized life that we live now. Everything that we do is very institutionalized, from education to medicine to living to dying. And to me, to see the Catholic worker living as it does, I think is a wonderful antidote to our very structured lives. Christian anarchism, my grandmother used to call it. Chaos, other people would probably call it. But, so anyway, that's my nutshell of my grandmother's life. She died in 1980, at the age of 83. In the years since then, there has been the cause for her canonization was opened not too long after her death, but nothing was really done until 2000, when Cardinal O'Connor in New York City officially opened her cause. And then, since then, there's been Dorothy Day Guild, it's in New York, the Archdiocese of New York houses it, and they are in the process right now of moving that cause forward. I have no idea. People ask me, well, when is this going to happen? I have no idea. I think none of us know. Or if it's going to happen. I mean, it's not so cut and dry. My grandmother provokes a lot of people. And there are people who are pushing back in terms of canonization. There's been a few other things that have kind of kept building her profile in the public view, and one of them is, of course, you'll remember, September of 2015, Pope Francis, in speaking before the US Congress, mentioned 4 great Americans: Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Merton, Martin Luther King Jr., and my grandmother, Dorothy Day. It was quite a funny moment. I was at the Catholic Worker House in New York City when he was giving his talk, and I was kind of late. What they do at Mary House, they don't have a TV room, so if there is some kind of program that they want to watch, they bring the TV down into the dining room where the women eat, and we all sit there and watch TV, and watch the program. I was late, and so I was coming in, running in, I sat down, and the very first words I heard out of Pope Francis's mouth were, "Dorothy Day," and I practically fell out of my chair. I said, what's going on? And basically, it was actually the 3rd time he had mentioned her. He mentioned her 4 times in that speech. And that really was an astounding moment, I think, for many of us. She was well known in her lifetime, but after her death, she kind of fell away in the public eye. And a lot of people have spent their lives at the Catholic Worker just trying to keep her spirit alive. And I think that this gave them so much hope to finally hear this recognition of just what she has done to help us and what she continues to do to encourage us, to help us, to keep us going. So that, again, is my nutshell of my grandmother's life. As Steve said, I'm the youngest of her 9 grandchildren. She had 1 daughter, my mother, Tamar. And it is as I said earlier, Tamar is the reason why I wrote this book. She and I spent years discussing her mother. After my grandmother's death, my mother and I spent a lot of winter evenings talking about Dorothy. And for those of you who know of her, you'll understand how that can be. And out of these conversations, I kept saying to my mother, you have to write your story. You've got to write the story. This is so important. Not only for, to fill out the picture of Dorothy Day as a mother, but also to tell your side of the story. My mother was 7 or 8 years old when the Catholic Worker started. And not only do I see her as the first Catholic in the story, but she's also the first Catholic worker in the story. And she grew up in the Catholic Worker. She also went to boarding school, but every single spare moment of her time was spent at the Catholic Worker. And she loved it. She absolutely adored it. It was so important to her. And so I kept saying to her, Mom, you have to write the story. Please write the story. And she kept saying, no, I can't write it. I can't write it. And so then finally I said to her after years, this process is very slow. To understand my mother, you have to understand that you can't push her in any way. I had to, whatever questions I had of her, I had to wait. And we had plenty of time. Well, limited time, but I thought we had plenty of time. And so every few years I would say to her, you gotta write your story. Then I gave up and I said, I'll write your story. And she said, no, you won't. And so I was like, okay, Mom, we'll write your story. A few years later, again, I'll say, Mom, you gotta tell the story, and if you're not gonna tell it, I'm going to tell it. And again, she would say, no, you cannot write the story. Now, as I mentioned, she died in 2008. Even though I knew she was failing, you're never ready for that moment. And when she died, I knew, whether I had her permission or not, I had to write this story. There was no choice in the matter. And I had to kind of figure out, my mother never said why she didn't want me to write this. I had to figure it out on my own, so I can only speculate. But I think there are two basic reasons, and these are two not reasons, but these are two ideas that I had in the back of my mind always as I was writing. One is my grandmother's life and the history of the Catholic worker is too complicated. And I mean this in a good way, that a lot of people have written about it. And my mother always felt that they did not get the heart of the matter. That to her, it was such a rich and powerful life, as was the life of her mother, that everyone was falling down in trying to describe this life. And she felt that it was impossible. So that was on one hand. On the other hand, she also, I believe, felt it was too painful for the story. This is a very difficult story. I've made, it turns out, quite a few people cry while reading this, especially my family members, my siblings. And so it was so important to me. I didn't want to open familial wounds without helping to close them also. And even though my mother was no longer alive and she couldn't tell me what to do and what not to do, and I just said to her, I spoke to her a lot after she died. I said to her, Mom, I'm so sorry. I know you don't want me to write this, but I have to. And you've got to help me. Well, the most amazing thing happened at that moment when I said, I have to write this book and you have to help me. I'm sure that there are some writers in the room who understand that you don't make a living as a writer. And I was faced with, what I thought would be like 2 or 3 years. Turned out to be 7.5 years. But I faced with, how am I going to earn money while I write this book? Well, both my mother and my grandmother were intensely practical people. And within, I would say, 10 days of me making this decision to write the book, I received a check in the mail from close friends who said, Kate, we just have this extra money laying around. We thought you could use it. $1,500, which was a lot of money for me. And I was like, okay, Mom, okay, Granny, I get the message. And what happened over the next years that it took to write this book, the checks kept coming. This wasn't the only check. And I was able to write this book. So as far as I'm concerned, I got my permission from my mother. And I got my permission from my grandmother. Didn't make it any easier. It's very hard. When you take the responsibility to write about other people, and not only my mother and my grandmother, but this story is, there's so many people involved. And this book actually is pretty much half the size of what I originally wrote. And a lot of things that were cut out were these portraits of fabulous people. The Catholic worker is about people. And I had to cut them out. But what I'm trying to say is that every single person that I wrote about in this book, I felt an immense responsibility for. Because most of them were dead and could not answer me if I did something wrong, if I said something wrong, they wouldn't be able to correct me. And it's a pretty powerful position to be in, to be writing about people who cannot respond. And so it was so essential for me not only to write about this very difficult story, but also to do it in a way that had absolute respect and a real rigorous process of finding the truth as best as I could, the best of my ability. And I know that I have made mistakes, but it was the only way I could get through writing this process was there was a mantra, Kate, just do the best you can. And I think, from what people have said, that they absolutely do believe that I have written as clear and honest of a book that is possible. And only a few mistakes, which the archivist at Marquette University, sent me a letter listing me all the mistakes that I had made. But there weren't that many, so I was grateful for that. What I'd like to do now is I'd actually like to read from the book. And I'm going to begin with, this is the preface, which I always read at my readings. And I'm sorry, Steve and a few other people in the classroom who heard it yesterday. But to me, this is the heart of where this book comes from, and how I was able to sustain myself through this entire writing process. This is kind of like my mission statement, and it's the only segment. It's the very first thing I wrote way back in 2009, and it's the only thing that has pretty much remained the same. The entire rest of the book has gone through so many revisions. But this preface really describes where I was when I began the book and why it was so important to me. So, in the last years of her life, my grandmother often woke up hearing in her mind the words from her beloved Dostoevsky, "The world will be saved by beauty." Of all the words she wrote, of all the quotes she loved to repeat, of all the advice and comfort she gave to countless people, in all 5 of her books and 50 years of her column, and in a lifetime of diary and letter writing, this is what has come to give me the most hope. For if after years of struggle, weariness, and a sense of deep and abiding failure, she believed in salvation through beauty, then how can we not listen? I discovered this aspect of my grandmother while reading her diaries. They were published 2 weeks after my mother's death, but it took almost a year before I could bring myself to open the book. Then, once opened, I couldn't put it down. It was as if I, dying of thirst, were given a long cold drink from the purest of wells. And as I read, I felt a growing need to add another layer to this tale, not only to portray the grandmother I knew and her daughter, her only child, Tamar, but also to somehow bring my grandmother and mother together in ways they hadn't been able to achieve while they lived. On the morning after I finished reading, I lingered in that half-asleep state where both dreams and reality take on a different quality altogether. That in-between state where you sometimes hear a voice you're certain is from someone in the room calling your name. And you wake up saying, "Yes, what is it?" But no one is there. My dream was brief, as dreams of this kind are. No beginning or end, just a flash containing all I needed to know. And in that moment I felt sure and true the knowledge of both Tamar's and Dorothy's lives, with all their experiences and memories. And I was overcome by this knowing. I felt the weight and the miracle of their lives. And I wondered if I were strong enough, wise enough to tell this story. But haven't I been working on it all my life, living in their wake and stumbling along, trying to make my own way? And isn't this my history also? One of the elements of what makes a person extraordinary, I have come to believe, is when their inner and outer lives are in accord. When what they do in the world is what their innermost being leads them to do. This is why the history of the Catholic worker is the history of my mother, the history of the relationship between my mother and grandmother, and the history of my family. The winter following my grandmother's death was bone-shivering, teeth-achingly cold, the temperature hovering between 20 and 30 degrees below zero night after night. At the time, my mother lived with her small black dog in a hand-built cabin on the edge of the woods. She was alone and grieving, and yet she turned to me. She was 54, and I was 20. In an effort to help us both through this dark time, she and I began this discussion about her mother. These talks were not often easy to follow. Their paths could be just as elusive as Tamar was herself. She was unfocused and uncollected. She jumped from thought to thought while I tried to follow her hints and allusions, or the sentences she couldn't bring herself to finish, telling me her story in the grab bag way she had. An image, a thought, a sparkle and flash of laughter, a retort of anger, regret, or loss. We continued our conversations on the first anniversary of Dorothy's death while staying at the Catholic Workers' Beach Cottage on Staten Island, New York. And then in a house in the small Vermont town of Springfield, where my mother moved from her cabin, a neighborhood rough, but full of poor, working-class families, just as Tamar liked it. Again and again, we returned to this discussion and to the last weeks of her life, 27 years later. Many writers, scholars, historians, and theologians have chosen to tell the story of Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker, the movement she began in the 1930s, grounded in performing the works of mercy, and that still exists today, decades after her death. But it seems to me that those who knew her best are often the ones most fearful of trying to write about her in all her complexity, richness, and contradictions. Tamar greeted each new book or film about her mother with fatalism. Yet she couldn't stay away, and she couldn't keep from being disappointed. Then, when such a person as Dorothy Day is your grandmother, an examination of her life isn't an intellectual, academic, or religious exercise. For me, it is nothing less than a quest to find out who I am through her and through Tamar. It is a quest to save my own life, though I don't yet know what this means. Seamus Heaney once said that in his poetry, he wrote about those moments he sensed held greater meaning within, even though he might not ever find out what that meaning was. And I see this quest, not only for me or for my family, but for anyone who senses that greater meaning and desires to explore it. There was a group of children who grew up the worker in the 60s and 70s who called Dorothy Granny, as my siblings and I do, though they were not related to her, and this is as it should be. We all need to live our lives as if we are Dorothy's children and grandchildren, being comforted and discomforted by her, as she invites us to be so much more than how we ordinarily see ourselves. And perhaps more important, how we see each other. Dorothy said there was never a time when she wasn't writing a book or thinking of writing a book, whereas Tamar wasn't a writer and had difficulty expressing herself in any medium. Dorothy was a talker, and my husband was too, she said. That was enough. But there did come a time when she felt the desire to write. When her father, Foster Batram, died 4 years after Dorothy, Tamar discovered in his apartment letters Dorothy had written to him in the 1920s and early 30s. In them, Tamar finally could read of the love and longing her mother felt for this silent man, so much like his daughter. In them, Tamar could once again see her mother, the Dorothy Day she so loved and who seems in danger of being lost to the world, a woman of great joy and passion, humor, and love of beauty. Tamar breathed the loss of this vibrant woman to the annals of hagiography and the desire to see her as a saint, and at times to Dorothy's own nature, especially during her severe and pious stage, as Tamar called it. In these letters, Tamar found what she had longed for, the love between her mother and father, Dorothy the saint and Foster the scientist, the two halves of her heart. And after reading these letters, she wanted to show the world this part of the story, her story. I can see the two of them in my mind's eye, a mother and daughter facing each other, loving each other, challenging each other. This is the story of my life, says one. No, this is the story, says the other. Many of Dorothy's favorite quotes had to do with love. Love is the measure by which we shall be judged. And where there is no love, put love, and you will find love. Those two are from St. John of the Cross. Then there's Dostoevsky. Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. But it is one of Dorothy's own quotes that I love the best. God understands us when we try to love. Tamar liked to say, all the world needs is loving kindness. Her love was of a more practical nature, the words of a mother of 9 and a steward of the land, whereas Dorothy's love had an element of mystery to it, a quality she needed for the life she led. Dorothy also said, we all feel alone and we always will. She said that we struggle against both freedom and responsibility, and with these two, we always will. Tamar said, we all must live our own disasters. Agony and foolishness, she called these lives we lead. For me, these quotes of theirs reveal something of the love they gave and received, the lessons they learned, and the heroism it required, each in her own way. I don't think they ever said these words to each other, for if they had, maybe then they would have been able to understand the nature of their struggle with one another. Maybe their intense love would have been leavened by this understanding. But Tamar was unable to write her story, as Dorothy was unable to write her book, her last book, in which it seems she wanted to make sense of this relationship between mother and daughter. And so here I am, left holding the pen, still grieving the loss of my mother, still grieving for the two of them, and led by the only thing that matters, the only thing worth writing about, love. So, that started me on a path that took me 7.5 years to complete. I want to read 2 more pieces if we have time. Do we have time? 2 more pieces?
We're going till 7, so it's all.
Oh, plenty of time. You get stuck listening to me for a long time. This is a piece that I absolutely love because it is so much my memories of both my grandmother and my mother. And something that I consider full of fun facts. In my mind, my mother's last years intertwine with my grandmother's. Those years when all was stripped away, bit by bit. And out of, pardon me. And out of all the losses of old age, I first think of Dorothy's and Tamar's love of driving, and of their cars, a long parade of battered vehicles that shouldn't have been able to run. Somehow they were always able to head down the road when things got too unbearable or too complicated, or when Dorothy got too ill-tempered and knew she had to seek refuge at the beach or at Tamar's or her sister Della's. Those hours on the road were precious to Dorothy, as they were the only time she felt free. She liked to make a pilgrimage, as she called it, every year in which she visited Catholic worker houses and farms around the country, packing lunches for the road of peanut butter and honey on whole wheat bread. Guarding the peace in one's heart, she called it. And when she had no car, she sat next to strangers on buses and trains who did not know who she was and did not weigh her down with their expectations, admiration, or criticism. On the road, she was anonymous. On the road, she was neither here nor there. If I had a good car, she said, I'd be on the road always. Dorothy had a reputation as a terrible driver, but I know of only one accident when Tamar was 3 years old and Dorothy had just learned how to drive in California. She fell in love with driving, beginning with her first car in Culver City, the second-hand Model T Ford she had bought for $85. And after one driving lesson, practiced alone in the back streets of Los Angeles. On the return from Mexico in 1930, She bought another Model T. She drove around Staten Island researching for her gardening column. The first worker car was a green Ford truck in which they transported vegetables from the farm at East End to the House of Hospitality on Mott Street, and returned with a truckload of people singing in Gregorian chant. It was in this truck that Dwight LaRoe taught Tamar how to drive when she was 15 in the fields of the lower farm. Next, they had a panel truck, which was good for transporting vegetables, but not for people, and someone fell out of the back of the truck on a steep hill to the upper farm. A year later, John Filger was transporting a goat in an old beat-up sedan when the goat jumped out into Easton's town square, and both John and the goat were arrested. During the war, 2 young thieves kept stealing the workers' car at Mott Street, and the police returned it each time. They had a 1928 Columbia that broke down in the Delaware Water Gap while moving from farm to farm. A 1936 Buick that had belonged to a television actress, and a 1932 Chevrolet donated by a fellow who had lost his license for drinking. Dorothy drove that Chevy to West Virginia to visit Tamar in the late 40s. And when Stanley's brother drove down with Dorothy, as they entered a mile-long tunnel on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, he asked her, "Where are the lights?" "It doesn't have any," Dorothy replied. The car had broken headlights and no windows, and the wind blew through the cracks in the floor. Dorothy's history with cars was a history of gas pedals going through the floor, gear sticks coming off in her hand, the battery falling out onto the ground just as she arrived home, or windshield wipers breaking off in the middle of heavy rainstorms. "I'll tell you what's miraculous about Dorothy," Tamar said. "She could get any car to run." I'd like to read one more piece, and then after that I'd like to open it up for questions. This is a piece, a little segment that I refer to as sainthood. After Tamar died, and we were going through her things, choosing which treasures we each wanted to keep, my sister Becky said, everything she had was broken. Every piece of Tamar's belongings had some damage. Furniture, dishes, vases, even the ceramic fish she used as a spoon holder on the stove. Becky sounded sad as she said this, as if Tamar felt she didn't deserve to have things that weren't broken. But maybe she was drawn to all things broken: creatures, teenagers, ceramic fish, wanting to help heal them, help make them whole. Maybe she saw beauty in the cracked, chipped, and repaired. This is the paradox we all live with, this flawed vessel called to holiness. Dorothy said, what a variety of people called to be saints: crotchety, giddy, cranky ones, bibulous ones. Stanley said, people come to the worker expecting to find saints, and instead they find human beings. Tamar said, everybody wants the other person to be a saint. She also once, with a slip of the tongue, referred to Dorothy as being tried for sainthood. Do you believe your mother is a saint? I asked Tamar during her last year. She surprised me, not that she answered. That would never have happened. But there was no dismissive flick of a hand, no vague shrug. Instead, her eyes lit up, and she laughed. In that last decade, when Tamar got back in touch with some of the old crowd, going back to the 1930s, one of the men who lived at the farm said to her, Dorothy was no saint. She laughed then too and didn't disagree, but neither did she agree. Again, she kept her own counsel. Tamar, ever practical and sensible, said the miracle of Dorothy's life is the Catholic worker, this modern-day parable of the loaves and fishes, and the church doesn't need to look any further. What riches she spread about her like St. Bridget's cloak, the one Bridget would hang on a sunbeam and which, when she spread it out on the ground, grew and grew until it covered the countryside, a glint of silver running along its edge as it brought abundance and beauty everywhere it touched. That's the miracle. That cloak spread out to give comfort and shelter to our most wounded in body and soul, as Dorothy handed out riches recklessly and with abandon to whomever she met. Here are just a few ways in which Dorothy spread that cloak about her. She gave a young seminarian money to pay for a year's tuition and expenses. She provided rent for a newly married couple who had met at the worker, supplied a down payment for a house for another, and paid off the mortgage for yet another. She made it possible for Cesar Chavez's wife, Helen, to accompany him to Italy to attend a personal audience with Pope Paul VI. And she helped put the Farm Workers Credit Union on its feet by purchasing more than $1,000 worth of shares. She gave $500 to a small, struggling farm school in Vermont. She put Audie Bethune on the path of her life's work by paying her tuition to a liturgical art course. She donated $30,000 to help start a housing cooperative in Washington Heights, $1,000 to the civil rights activist Marge Baroni, and another $1,000 to the Rural Advancement Fund. During one month in the early 1970s, Dorothy sent out more than $3,000 to a home for mothers, to the Medgar Evers Fund, and to other Catholic worker houses. She gave money to PBS, Danilo Dolci, and the Committee for Artistic and Intellectual Freedom in Iran. She helped people pay rent, tuition for nursing school, real estate school, and special needs schools, and for a graduate program application fee. She gave money to local churches, credit unions, and co-ops, and provided seed money for homesteaders. She paid doctor's bills and car repairs and bought computers for a school for children with developmental disabilities. There's a rumor she helped a young woman attend opera school. "I'd like to come back as an opera singer," she once said. "Then I could bring beauty into people's lives, rather than tell them what's wrong with the world." And who could even begin to have a sense of the sheer numbers of meals eaten, shelter given, clothing handed out, and visits to hospitals, jails, and courts, all part of that practical, visible, miraculous cloak. Thank you.
And I know you brought your own questions with you and your own stories perhaps, so let's just start by going straight to the audience with questions. Yeah, Megan.
Thank you for being here today. I look forward to reading your book. Sometimes in my classes I show Don't Call Me a Saint, and I don't know if it's because of the editing, but there are a couple of moments in that documentary that juxtapose some of your mother's reactions to Dorothy. On the one hand, there seems to be a sense of longing that when the worker came along, your mother sort of, Dorothy wasn't around as much. And on the other hand, there's a clip that says, "She did everything for me, she was always there for me." And my students have a hard time reconciling these dual pictures of your mother's impression of her mother. Sometimes they come away with the sense that Dorothy was not a good mother. I think it's a judgmental perspective and very sexist, personally. But I'm wondering how you would respond to students' concerns about the relationship between your mother and Dorothy, and how you can maybe help me respond when students say things like that. Thank you.
Well, as with everything in this story, both things are true. My mother, when the Catholic War started, my mother lost that first 7 years in which she had her mother to herself. And I think that those first 7 years were absolutely crucial to their relationship, and really gave both of them the strength to continue ahead in the years of the Catholic worker when my grandmother was called away more and more to speak publicly. My mother went to boarding school, and it was the beginning of my mother understanding what was going on. I mean, she was the first person to say that the boarding school was full of students of single-parent homes. And it was not an unusual situation at all. That said, there is this narrative, and I think you're right that this is sexist. There is this narrative that has gone on for far too long that my grandmother was an indifferent mother or a bad mother. My mother heard those accusations, and they hurt her so deeply that she didn't know how to respond. When she said that her mother was always there for her, that is true too. They had an intensely close relationship until my grandmother's death. Talked to each other practically every day, wrote to each other, visited each other. My grandmother was there for every single one of my mother's crises and births. She was there for all of our births except for me, because I came too early. It wasn't my grandmother's fault. So there is this, yes, it was very difficult for both of them, those separations. But my mother was very wise as a child. She learned early on that she had to share her mother with a lot of people. And I think it really is a testimony to my mother's strength that not only did she understand this, but she also did the same thing. There's a lot of, people who came to the worker with great needs. And one of the most basic need was to have my grandmother as their mother. And in many ways, my mother had to kind of see this level of need and live with jealousy on the part of people that weren't strong enough to understand what they were doing. And my mother always understood them, always came to their defense, never held this against them all her life. And so she, on one hand, she did long for this intensity of relationship that they had before the worker. But on the other hand, she loved the Catholic worker. She loved all of her aunties and uncles that she had at the worker. And so, it's a very complicated situation, and not black and white. And I think certainly coming from the point of view of my mother, it was, and for myself, it was so important for me to address in this book just the strength of this relationship. And if someone says one more time to me that my grandmother was an indifferent mother, I don't know what I'm going to do. I mean, for one, my grandmother didn't have an indifferent bone in her body over anything. And two, I don't know what it is about that narrative that she was a bad mother, but people seem to need it somehow. And I'll just say, it is not true. I mean, and my mother was so gobsmacked by that accusation that she literally could not respond to it. She could not set the record straight. And of course, because she had both these strands, that the memories of that separation, of those longings, and also the decades of such an intense relationship. So I hope that kind of fleshes that out a bit.
Good, thank you. Other questions? Yes, we'll get a microphone to you. Just 1 second. Your left.
Thank you. I just want to thank you so much for your book. It is just so beautiful, and thank you for sharing your mother with us, someone that we didn't really know too much about, and the complexities of the relationships. It's just so beautifully written. And I guess one of the poignant stories for me was when your mother struggled at the end, when Robert Ellsberg was going to publish the diaries and certain things that she, I'm sure, felt probably because how it would be, how things might be taken. You know, I sense this very strong love and relationship between her and your grandmother, and she didn't want things to be misrepresented, and yet she had her own struggles, and the conversation that he had with her, and I just wonder, like, what it was like for you to be part of such those intimate stories, and as your mother, when the letters were found, as she learned more about her father and mother's relationship together, and how she was had so many qualities of her father. That must have been a beautiful kind of recognition. And I just, there's just so much intimacy in it, and I guess I just wonder what it was like for you to be present to that. That's my question.
That's a complicated question, not easily answered. There are so many things that have gone through me, and certainly have, each decade has brought its own interesting questions. I'll just address a few things that jumped out at me as you were speaking. When my mother showed me the letters that her mother had written her father, I couldn't read them. They were too intimate. I felt like I was peering into something that was not meant for me to look at. And so I just kind of backed away and just handed them back to my mom and said, "Oh, great, Mom, thanks." And then as the years went on, because she had those letters for probably about 13 years before she gave them to Marquette University, the archives. And in this time, she would speak about them, and slowly it started to dawn on me that these letters were crucial to her, that if she hadn't found those letters, there may have been questions that she would have never been able to answer. And so I realized that if I wanted to understand my mother, I had to read these letters. And in that process, I not only began to understand my mother, but I also began to understand my grandmother in many ways that I hadn't before. In terms of, understanding all of them, understanding the three of them, understanding my mother and grandmother's relationship, it's been, on one hand, and this is another one of these paradoxes that I had to deal with in this process. On one hand, I could see that the most important relationship to my mother was with her mother. It was not with her husband. It was not with her children. And yet, it is a huge testimony to my mother that I never once felt any lack in the love that she had for me. So here I started to realize what an incredible source of love and container of love that my mother was, and how unusual it is to have that intensity of relationship with her mother not affect, certainly me. I can't speak for all my siblings. I come from a very large family. We all have completely different experiences. But certainly for me, I never once felt any lack of attention, lack of love from my mother. Now, those are the things that jump out at me. I don't know if that covers all that you were asking. Probably not. But I'm still working this out. There's still a lot to understand. There's these two major threads in my life, my grandmother and my mother, and other threads, my father and my grandfather. But my mother and grandmother are such incredibly strong influences that this is a process that I'm going through to kind of discover, well, what is my thread? So, all I can say is I'm working on this.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. There's a microphone coming. Just 1 second to help us all hear it. Pass it down the row there.
While might not be part of the book and what you really focused on, would you mind telling us a little bit about your relationship with your grandmother, with Dorothy, and with the worker, I guess, because I understand that you spent some time there and so forth.
Even though we lived in Vermont, my mother made a real strong effort to make sure that we spent every moment we could down at the farm that was then in Tivoli, New York, upstate New York, on the Hudson River. A fabulous place. This was, the place opened in 1964, and it really was magical. And my mother said later on, she said to me, I brought you down to Tivoli because I wanted you, all of us kids, to grow up with the same love for the Catholic worker that she had. And it worked. Certainly for me, it worked. It really is, at this point, after the death of my mother, my remaining home is the Catholic worker. Even though I don't live there, even though, I live a very different life, but it really is my home. I certainly feel it, particularly, I'm speaking of the New York City houses, Mary House in particular. And one of the reasons why I'm so connected to Mary House is that was where my grandmother spent the last 3 years of her life, 1976, last 4 years of life, 1976 to 1980. And she was, up until that time, I knew her very well. She cared for me for 4 months when my mother was in nursing school. We, as I said, we went down to the Catholic worker farm. We'd spent entire summers there, and spent a lot of time with my grandmother. But she was very active. She was very public. I wasn't able to really sit down and talk with her. I was only 7, 8, 9. I was running around. It wasn't until her health started to fail and she had to slow down, and I was a teenager and could more understand her and what she was doing, that we were able to have these longer conversations. And I am so grateful for that time. Even though she was suffering greatly with heart failure, we were able to spend this time together. Not only she and I, but my mother and Stanley Wisniewski, who is one of these wonderful Catholic worker characters who showed up in 1934 at the age of 17 or 18, and ended up remaining his entire life. He was like a son to my grandmother, he was like a brother to my mother, and he was like an uncle to all of us. So there was this time, those last 3 or 4 years, that the 4 of us were just able to be together. And people ask me, well, what did you talk about? What did she talk about? And all I can say is that she told stories. She was a storyteller. She was a fabulous storyteller. And we would all just sit there and listen. And she would talk about not only her past, but she would talk about all the people that she knew, that she had met. She would read aloud from her letters. She had this amazing correspondence with people all over the world. She was always writing letters, always receiving letters. And so it just opened up this world to me, this fabulous world, as a teenager, really sparked my imagination. Now, at this time, she wasn't writing anymore, but one of my earliest memories of my grandmother is seeing her at her typewriter. And I was like 7 years old, and I'd peer around the door into her room, and she'd be there pounding away, and she was fast. She was a great typist, so much like, I can't remember, she had those green shade things that they used to wear. I just had this image, I don't know if it's correct, but that's the image I have. And I was amazed. I was like, what are you doing? And, my mother was like, shh. Granny is trying to write. And I'm like, write? You mean you can write? What is this writing? You make a living at it? That really caught my attention. My grandmother as a writer was one of the most probably formative things for me as a young child. Now, of course, as I said, each decade has brought a new element that has really formed me. But that, when she was alive, those are the things that really fed me.
I had a question for you, and I'm wondering what does it state for you in the Roman Catholic process of canonization? We all have views of what a saint can be in our lives, and this is a complicated story for so many different reasons, but what does the Catholic process of canonization mean to you with regard to your story?
Again, this is a complicated situation, full of paradox. Personally, I believe she's a saint. There is no doubt in my mind. And what that means, that's hard for me to describe. It's a mystery, really. All I can say is that she transforms us in some way that she changes us. If we are spending any time examining her life, we have to examine our own life. I don't see any way out of that. And I think that she does it in such a visceral way. I don't think we find our way to her through our intellect. I think, certainly in what I've been hearing from people, we find our way to her through our heart and through our gut. It's not through our minds. And whether this is a saint or not, I don't know. But, I pray to her. She certainly has answered my prayers. I know many people pray to her, and people feel that they have that kind of relationship with her as a saint. Now, you're asking about the process of sainthood. Now, this is, it's a very canonical, bureaucratic, step by step. You have to tick all these boxes. So on one hand, there is this bureaucracy of sainthood, and then this wondrous person who you cannot tie down. I think this is probably one of the ways in which people don't know what to make of her, is that, she is an obedient daughter of the church, but she also said that you cannot be a Catholic without being in permanent dissatisfaction with the church. So, there's that, and that kind of thing drives people up a wall, because they can't say, oh, she's this and not that. She makes us, and I think this is the definition of genius, is how you hold two paradoxical ideas, and both of them are true. And she did that all the time, and that is one way. I'm not an expert on the canonization process, so I really can't speak that way. And also, I don't believe it's my job to be involved. I have been asked to be involved with the Dorothy Day Guild, but my primary relationship, all said, saint aside, my primary relationship with her is she's my grandmother. I'm her granddaughter, and that to me is sacred enough.
What a lovely answer. We have a few more minutes still. Let's do a question here and then here. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask you in this, to use your word, complicated story about occasions when Forster, your mother, and Dorothy were together. I have a picture of the funeral procession coming out of in New York, and I noticed, which made me want to ask you, that your mother and Forster are in that procession very close together. And I just wondered if you could say a bit about how the relationship between Dorothy and your mother and Forster over time, what that was like.
That's a lovely question, and it's a lovely story. They, as both Foster and my grandmother aged And with all the hospital visits and crises, medical crises, they got closer and closer. Now it did start, there was a period, they were never not in touch because they had a child together. So there was always, working things out, things to discuss about my mother. But then after my mother married and was raising her family, my grandmother and grandfather drifted apart. In 1959, they were in contact, I should say. They were in contact because they were both at places on Staten Island. In 1959, there was something that happened that really brought them together, and that was my grandfather's partner, Nanette, was dying of cancer. And Foster called my grandmother up and said, please help. And she came and she helped. She not only helped care for Nanette, but she also made sure that as Nanette was failing, that my grandmother was great in tagging other people to do work. And one of the things that she did is she asked 2 nurses that were volunteering at the work to come and care for Nanette. And it was at this time that they kind of, they spent a lot of time together, Foster and my grandmother. It was a very difficult time. I mean, it practically broke my grandfather's heart to watch Nanette die. But they also realized that they still loved each other. And, I was talking earlier, I can't remember whether it was the class yesterday, or I can't remember what we're talking, but one of the things that my grandmother would do when things got too tough was flee. She was a great believer in fleeing. And so after this, when Nanette died, it was a very difficult period of about 3 months, 4 months, and she realized that there was still love between her and Foster. She fled. She did a cross-country trip, talk of like 4 months. But after that, they really became much more in touch. There was a time in which they spoke to each other every day by phone. There was a time when Foster would come to Mary House to visit, especially when my mother was, well, he would only come when my mother was there. So the 3 of them really started spending a lot of time together those last 3 or 4 years. And it's only by one decision that my mother made that Foster wasn't with my grandmother when she died. He was meant to be visiting at that moment, and my mother just said to him, maybe it's not best to come right now, she's not doing very well. And so he didn't. And so I think it really would have changed the narrative a lot if people, if that had happened, people realized that Foster had been with her at her death. As it was, my mother was the only person with her. The funeral, it actually was quite funny. The funeral, one element was funny in that, there was a lot of people who came to the funeral, Abby Hoffman being one of many, really interesting crowd of people. And every time my grandfather would see someone famous in the crowd, he'd think, oh, I gotta tell Dorothy. And then he'd realize we're just where he was. But there's also another, I don't know which photo you're thinking of, but there is one photo that when I came across, really said so much to me, and that was after the funeral when people were coming out of the church. My mother is coming out and Foster is right behind her and they're holding hands, and just this, the feeling that I got from them, my mother in grief and shock and also relieved. She was relieved because her mother had been suffering a great deal. And then my grandfather just also in complete shock, and how they were supporting each other as they left the funeral.
Thank you. We have time for one last question from Marianne.
Thank you. I spent a couple months at Mary House in the late 1970s when your mother was ill and was living on Staten Island. And your grandmother, I mean. And I did have an opportunity to go there, like to bring something over, whatever. And I kind of had this pride of a young person, like, well, I didn't come to the Catholic Worker just to meet Dorothy Day. And so, of course, I've always regretted it. But the question, and I want to thank you for coming, and I look forward to reading your book. But the one question I have, and you kind of alluded to it, so maybe I've already gotten the answer, when you were talking about the paradox of your grandmother with Catholicism. But it's a kind of an anecdote sort of thing that I've always heard, that Dorothy was a very, in a certain sense, a traditional Catholic with regard to some issues, and yet a radical Catholic with regard to social issues. And that it was said that if, I think Cardinal Spellman would come to her and ask and say to shut down the Catholic worker, that she would do it out of obedience as a Catholic. Does that fit with your memory or your impression? I used to look into her room, actually, when I lived at Mary House. We lived in the old music theater part on the stage. We called ourselves a stage crew, about 4 of us. But anyway, that's my question.
I've heard that story too, and I think it's absolutely true. And it also is part of her genius and paradox, in that she would have shut it down, but she also knew that she would never be asked to shut it down. I think there's a certain kind of authority that she had, and that it, when you have the works of mercy as your mission statement, it's very hard to shut that kind of work down. And she said, towards the end of her life, she says, well, shut down the paper, shut down the houses. You can't stop this kind of work.
Thank you so much.